Morning. All right, let's go ahead and start with section 3.4, more with equalities and unknowns. So in our last lesson we saw that we can find an unknown in an equation by getting the unknown on a side by itself. And we do this by performing the same operation with the same quantity of both sides. While all of our examples in the last lesson were problems with addition and subtraction, now we're going to be looking at multiplication and division. Okay, so here's an example. 2 times x equals 8. Now do you see why we have to use the dot or parentheses? Because if this said 2xx, you might go, wait, what? So it's 2 times x equals 8. Now, you're going to start by doing the opposite of multiplication, which is division. And we have to do the same thing to both sides. So in order to get x by itself, we'll have to divide both sides by this number, 2. So 2 times x divided by 2. Now remember, this here is another way of writing 2 times x divided by 2 equals 8 divided by 2. Both that fraction line right there and the division symbol are both symbols for division. Now since we only have multiplication in the numerator, we can simplify 2 times x divided by 2 the same way we've been simplifying the fractions. So in this case, we'll divide both the numerator and the denominator by 2, leaving us with x equaling 4. So these cancel each other out. 2 divided by 2, bam, gone. So you're left with x by itself equals what this is over here. But what they did here was they just simplified things. So they crossed these out and then crossed this out because 2 goes into 8 4 times. So they just did some simplification. Okay, and then obviously you can plug your numbers back in to make sure that everything works right. So your original equation was this. Substitute 4 for x equals 8. That's true. 2 times 4 does equal 8, so everything's done correctly. Now, while we're focusing on the math to learn this skill, don't lose sight of what these unknowns represent. They represent quantities that we don't know. For example, the x in this example could stand for the cost of each item if we buy 2 items for $8. That would be 2 times x, where the x is the cost of each of those bottles of olive oil. So don't lose sight of the fact that this is real life stuff. Now, it's important to note that the fraction line means to divide the entire numerator by the entire denominator. In the case of 2 times x divided by 2, 2 times x are factors making up a product. By dividing one of the factors, we're accomplishing the same thing that we would be if we divided to the end product. To see this, let's put an actual value to the expression instead of using x. So instead of x, let's put 4. Okay? So this is the same thing as saying 8 divided by 2. That's why you can say this is 2 times x would be the same thing as something like this. It's one quantity. It's not 2 separate quantities. It's one quantity. So 2 times 4 equals 8. 8 divided by 2 equals 4. Same answer you'd obtain by crossing out those 2's. See how they've crossed them out? Okay. Now, the same does not hold true when there's addition or subtraction involved. For example, 8 plus 2 divided by 2 means to divide the sum of 8 and 2, or 10, by 2. Notice that we would have gotten the wrong answer if we'd simply crossed out those 2's, as we'd be dividing only part of the numerator by 2, because the numerator is 10, not 8 plus 2. So you can't, when it's addition or something else up here, you can't do these as separate. Once again, we're continuing to build on these properties and principles that we've looked at. Okay, we'll go ahead and move on. Now here's another example. This is x divided by 2 equals $4. So to make x divided by 2 equals 4 easier to work with, we're going to rewrite it using this fraction. So x divided by 2 equals 4. Now, if you multiply both sides by 2, the same quantity, the multiplication will reverse the division by 2. Okay, the 2's cancel out. So divide both sides, this side by 2, multiply both sides by 2, because multiplication is the opposite of division. So that's going to cause these 2's to cancel out. So you're left with x equals 4 times 2, which x equals 8. Then of course you can check. Here's the original equation. Here they've plugged in their answer, and yes, it's true. So To find an unknown in an equation, get the unknown on a side by itself. Do this by performing the same operation using the same quantity on both sides of the equation. Same thing we did yesterday, except it's multiplication and division, so don't let it confuse you. Now, you might be wondering why you need to learn to find unknowns by isolating them on one side of the equation. All the problems we've looked at so far have been so simple, you could have just solved them in your head. And that is true, but later in this course, we'll see how to use this technique to solve problems that you could not otherwise solve. We're practicing on simple problems to learn the basics, much as you practice learning how to read by sounding out simple words. So as you practice finding these unknowns, keep in mind that our ability to change both sides of an equation the same way without affecting the equality relies on the consistencies God created and sustains. If He weren't keeping multiplication and division operating the same way in creation, we'd have no basis to assume that multiplying or dividing by the same quantity would leave both sides of an equation that represented a real-life problem equal. Nor could we rely on the identity property of multiplication to hold true. So all of this math depends on God's faithfulness in holding all the creation together. All right, so let's go ahead and then move to the worksheet, which is 3.4. Okay, this is the same thing we did yesterday, except it's not addition and subtraction, it's multiplication and division. So let's see, I'll do one of those. This is checking your work like we did yesterday. On the back, same thing here that we did yesterday, and then some skill sharpening. Okay, so this ought to be really easy. So let's go ahead and look at, we'll do this one. Okay, so x times 8 equals 64. Okay, remember what I said. Rewrite the problem. Oh, my computer's going to be very slow. Any day. Well, I apologize, but my computer is not wanting to cooperate. Let's see if we can do it this way. There we go. Okay, so we're going to rewrite the problem. X times 8 equals 64. Just rewrite the problem. All right, this is multiplication, so we're going to divide both sides by 8, canceling this out. So we're left with x by itself. 64 divided by 8 is 8. There you are. Okay? All right, so I'm going to leave you to this page. I'm not going to grade it. I want to see it. I just want to make sure you're understanding all of this. And I think we have a quiz, not tomorrow, but the next. We have several more lessons to do before we have a quiz. So if you have any trouble on any of this, either look back in your book or look at the page that you did prior to this, or let me know, and I'll be happy to work through some of these with you, okay? That's all for today.